Hey guys, this is a video to do section 1 of chapter 1 of what we've done in class. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So the main idea for this first section, the study of life, is that all living things share characteristics of life. So we'll go through that. The objectives for this lesson, so what I want you to get out of this, is to know the definition of biology, the possible benefits from studying biology, and then to know what the characteristics of living things are. So this is our vocabulary for this section. So we'll have those words in red text throughout. Okay, and all the highlighted words, just so you know, you can do your follow along notes. I've highlighted those missing words for you so that way they're easy to see. Okay, so what is biology? Biology is the study of life. It comes from the Greek word bio, meaning life, and from logos, which means study. So anytime you see like ology, that's saying the study of. Now bio is used in a lot of different words, such as like biotechnology, biochemistry, biodegradable. All of those words, I think another one that someone came up with was biography. So that word's used a lot. And a lot of science words, we can really simplify them if we can break them apart. And biology is no exception. So what biology does is it studies the origins and histories of life and once living things, the structures of living things, how living things function, and then how they interact with one another. So structure and function is really interesting and important to study. So as we learn like anatomy and physiology, if you take that class later, you'll learn what the parts of the body are called, so that's the anatomy part, but also how they function, the physiology, how does it work. So those are things that biologists will study also. And they also look at how living things interact with one another. So biology also relates to other sciences. It's also closely related to chemistry. Chemistry is when we're talking about matter, things being made of atoms and molecules. That's the very simplest form of matter. In biology, we have biomolecules, so they come together to create living things. So biochemistry and organic chemistry are also important branches of science to understand when studying biology. And also, on a side note, anything that's referring to the word organic is referring to anything that has the element carbon. And life forms on planet Earth are all composed of carbon molecules. So what is a biologist, and why would you study biology? So biologists will study the diversity of life, research disease, develop technologies, and improve agriculture. And also, they preserve the environment. So we'll go through examples of each of those. So studying for the purpose of diversity of life, some biologists make discoveries and look for explanations by either performing laboratory or field studies. So they might sit and observe wildlife in its natural setting. A very famous biologist that did this is Jane Goodall. She studied chimpanzees and observed them in their natural environment and was able to bring a lot of data and a lot more understanding of chimpanzees that we didn't know of yet. Biologists that study the research disease, these biologists are researching to develop new treatments for disease. Now, particularly the COVID-19 vaccine that's being researched right now is a work in progress, but those types of biologists are working hard to make sure we have an effective treatment for that disease. So that's very timely to talk about something like that. Now, biologists also develop technologies. Now, we think of technology, and we use that word in our society a lot when we're talking about like our cell phones or computers. But really what technology is, by definition, it's the application of science, or when we apply science or science knowledge to solve human needs. So an example of this in biology is Dr. Charles Drew, who developed methods to to separate blood plasma for blood transfusions. So based on his research and understanding that, we have blood banks that are used based on his research that really help us as a society. The next one, so this was a video that is another piece of technology as we have our technology improving in the realm of prosthetics. This is a video of a gentleman moving his hand, as you can see, and that just the movement of his hands and activating those neurons that activate fingers, that's what's controlling the robotic arm there. So what is once thought of as science fiction, like as our technology gets better, is becoming more and more reality, where we might have the prosthetics be even more intelligent to respond to our thinking and how those nerve impulses work. So that was something kind of interesting where our technology is headed. Biologists also work hard to improve agriculture. So some biologists study genetic engineering of plants. So I know in the supermarket we might see like non-GMO, but what they're really doing is developing plants that can survive in better conditions and even make them to grow larger. So they'll develop plants that could grow in maybe poor soils, that in areas of the world that might not necessarily be able to grow crops. And they also make them in a way that they on their own can resist insects and disease without us having to use pesticides. And like I said, they can also use that technology to make crops grow larger as well. There are also biologists to preserve the environment. So these biologists will try to protect animals and plants from extinction by developing reproductive strategies and ways to protect them. So conservation is another big focus of biology, where scientists are working hard to preserve the environment. Okay. Characteristics of life. So this is our last objective. So how do you know something is alive? How do you define life? So we did a lab activity previous to doing this lesson, and I think you'll find that when we characterize, or what you thought all living things have to have, maybe they didn't quite match up with some of the examples that were in the lab. So there are 8 things that scientists have agreed that all life forms have to have. So if you're looking at the skeleton here, is the skeleton alive? Why or why not? So think about that based on what living things have to have. Or maybe the argument could be, is it dead or is it non-living? So what's the difference between them? So to say something that is dead versus alive, that relationship is that something that's dead is something that once had all of the characteristics of life at one time, but no longer do, versus something that's non-living that never had any of those characteristics. So we'll move on. What are those 8 characteristics? So an organism, we use that word a lot in biology, is anything that has or once had any of these 8 characteristics. So we'll go through them one by one. So the first one, that they're made of one or more cells. So cells are the most basic unit and structure of all living things. So an organism could be unicellular, which means one cell, or they could be multicellular, which means many cells. The second is that they display organization, and when we use the word organization, we're saying that things are arranged in an orderly way. So if that's a unicellular organism, we can see in the paramecium here that it is a single cell, but it has components inside of it, these functional structures called organelles, that work to keep it living. So it is highly organized. And then multicellular organisms like you and me and this rat here, we also have a very set way that we are organized. So we are made of cells, but those cells make up tissues. Those tissues make up organs. We have several organs that create organ systems, and then all the organ systems together make an organism like us. The next is that they grow and develop. So most organisms begin as a single cell, but when we talk about growth and development, growth means that they're adding mass, such as new cells and new structures to them, and they develop, which is the process that an organism will go through during its lifetime. Like this tadpole here, it has a set natural set of changes that it's going to go through from egg to tadpole to frog. Also, organisms reproduce, which means the production of offspring. So species, on that note, are organisms that can breed with one another and produce fertile offspring themselves. So it's important that not only organisms can breed and produce offspring, but that their offspring can also produce offspring. But reproduction can be argued a bit because it's not essential for the survival of an individual, but it is essential for the survival of the species. The next one is respond to stimuli. So we're talking about stimuli or responding to something that's in the outside environment, but also organisms respond to things that are inside, internal in their environment too. So a stimulus versus a response. A stimulus is anything internal or external in the environment that causes a reaction by the organism. The response is that reaction. So for instance, let me move my webcam here. We have a plant here. So we can respond to stimuli. If you were poked, you would obviously react to that, and that's your response. But plants do it too. There is this plant here that the stimulus is the light, and it is growing towards the light. So that is a plant showing that it responds to a stimulus also. So that also organisms require energy in the form of food. All organisms need to eat. Now there are some organisms that can create their own food, like plants, and then there's some organisms that have to get that energy by consuming other organisms. So words that we're going to use throughout the course too is autotroph and heterotroph. Again, we'll break down the science words. So auto, meaning self, these are organisms that use light to make their own food, such as plants and some unicellular animals. Now heterotroph, hetero means different, and troph means eating, so they eat different things. But if we think about it, and we'll go through trophic levels when we talk about ecology, understand that all energy ultimately comes from the sun. Also, so 7, organisms maintain homeostasis. So homeostasis is the regulation of an organism's internal conditions to help it stay alive. So everything inside of the organism must maintain balance. So there might be some stressors that affect an organism, but then they'll have things in place to get them back to a normal state. So they want things to be balanced. An example of this would be like a house. So in the wintertime, you want to keep the inside of the house a nice, comfortable temperature to live in. So in the wintertime, you might turn on the heater to keep the house warm because you want the inside of it to be livable. Or if it is cold out or too warm outside, you might throw the AC on to make sure the inside of the house still stays that nice temperature. Our bodies do this too. So say if you went for a run, your body's using up more energy and you're making your temperature go up. So there's factors in place to maintain homeostasis, like sweating to help cool you down, or increasing your heart rate to get more oxygen flowing so those cells can get the oxygen they need. Now, metabolism is a little bit different. So that word is also used with organisms, but metabolism is really referring to the chemical reactions that take place in an organism. So it's kind of a relationship between homeostasis and the energy usage, but this refers to those chemical reactions taking place in the organism to keep it alive. So last is adaptations that evolve over time. So in biology, we use the word adaptation a little differently than most. So adaptation is any inherited characteristic that results from changes in a species over time. This enables species to survive and pass their genes to the next generation. And it is developed in responses to environmental factors. So for instance, this finch here, which is located, there are very similar finches on islands, and each finch might have a different beak shape based on the food that's available. So that one island might have finches that all have this beak shape. Another island has all this shape, and it's because maybe the food that's available is reflecting that. So that trait is what's passed down to each generation of bird. We also see this with the snowshoe hare, for instance. We'd say the white fur is an adaptation for it to survive in the wintertime, or the brown fur is an adaptation in the summer so that it can survive and be camouflaged in its environment. The plants are the same way. In tropical environments, drip-tip plants are better because they repel water. So they're better adapted to live in that environment. Cacti, also, they're better adapted for dry environments because they're able to retain moisture for a long time. So in biology, that's the verbiage we would use. We would say those are adaptations. And this is the end.